very warm welcome tonight. Thank you so much for coming to Bristech Bytesize. And for those of you who haven't been to an online Bristech event, it's going to be kept to an hour, and I'll show you the timings in a second. And for anyone who is new to Bristech, basically we started as a meetup back in 2013, grew pretty organically, spawned the conference in 2015, which we did for a few years. And last year we actually did an MLOps conference online because of COVID, and this year, who knows? It's all a little bit up in the air. So we're going to see how we feel, but we haven't got any plans at the minute for the conference. But on to tonight. So I'm really pleased to welcome Mark Smith from Storm. He's waving there. Hi, Mark. Who's going to be giving a talk of convention over configuration. And joining us after the talk and the Q&A, we have Adam Butler and Adam Pope. So I'll introduce you to those two a bit later on. They're waving in the windows there. And for those of you who are munching on popcorn, a big shout out to Claudia at Storm, who sorted out the popcorn. So good job on the popcorn. That was a really nice touch. So tonight, after the waffling from me, straight into the talk from Mark. We will then have the Q&A via the chat window. So if you have questions that arise during the talk, then please do put them in the chat window. And afterwards, I will then create the Q&A by just picking people out. And if you want to unmute, ask a question to Mark, and then obviously Mark will answer. Following the Q&A, we're then going to vamp into the panel before we close, and there we'll hopefully pick out some of the broader themes, some of the things that key off the talk, maybe some swerve balls, who knows, let's see where that goes. But we're going to keep it to a punchy hour. We've got other stuff to do, so yeah, and forgive me if we're a few minutes over, but we generally keep it to the hour. So for those of you who didn't see the message, please do introduce yourself in the chat window. We're also very interested to see who's on the call. Please put your cameras on ideally, but obviously it's not mandatory. You will be muted. If you want to unmute, that's absolutely fine. And the Q&A windows, like I said, will be in the chat window. So without further ado, I would like to introduce you to Mark Smith, who is a senior Ruby developer at Storm. And Mark, do please take it away.
I will do. Let me set up the screen share. I've unmuted already, so it's going well so far. So yeah, this is the title for the talk, which many of you will have seen already. We're going to get into the details of that shortly, but firstly, I'm going to tell a bit of a story. You'll see that I've got a beard. When I don't have a beard, I look a lot younger. So I'm going to tell a story about one of my first development jobs. I looked a bit more like this, and I had a small conversation with my boss at the time. He and other sort of leadership within the company were looking at what projects to put me on next, and he said to me, "Do you know any PHP?" And I said, "Not really, no." Now, I was very junior at the time. I didn't have much experience in any particular language, but PHP was the language I knew the best. But I'd recently started learning Ruby on Rails. I found that very exciting and fun. And so I didn't really want to, what in my mind felt like a step back and go back to working on PHP. I said no, knowing that if I'd said no, I'd be put on a Rails project. And that's what happened. In hindsight, you know, naive younger me probably shouldn't have maybe lied to my boss. I'm not just saying that because my current boss is on the call watching. But either way, I'm in many ways glad that happened, because since then I've now been primarily working with Ruby and with Rails, and that's what I'm going to be talking about tonight. For the past 4 years, I've been at Storm Consultancy. Storm is a digital technology agency based in the city of Bath. I've got a slide here that is very much ripped from our marketing info. Most of my slides don't have as many drop shadows and things. But yeah, so we're based in the city of Bath, but we have national and international clients. And we work predominantly with startups, scale-ups, and innovative businesses and organizations. We have a strong blend of business consultancy, especially in that startup and scale-up space. And then we have the full team of technology, from planning to designing to prototyping through to the build, which is obviously where I and the other developers come in. We've built the world's largest life science data provider powered by machine learning and AI. We've helped to reshape how charitable grants in the UK are applied for. We've helped to launch the National Institute for Coding. We're currently working on a few environmentally focused projects, among other things. So the structure of my talk, roughly, I'm going to talk a bit about Ruby, the programming language. I'm going to talk a little bit about the Ruby on Rails web development framework. We're then going to particularly dive into the concept of convention over configuration, which is something within Rails that I'll talk about. We'll particularly talk about how that impacts the work we do at Storm. I'm coming from the point of view of, I think it's great. I really enjoy working with Rails. I enjoy most of the things that I'm going to be talking about tonight. So that's my angle. Then we're going to fly through a few technical examples, parts of Rails, and how they tie into this paradigm of convention over configuration. And then we'll go even further about stuff at Storm specifically, and how we've taken that and how we work with that on a day-to-day basis. A lot of the info from my talk is drawn from what is called the Rails Doctrine, which you can find online, as well as just my experience and some of my colleagues' experiences of building Rails apps for many years. So what is Ruby? This is just a quote directly from the Ruby official website. Ruby is a dynamic open source programming language where they focus on simplicity and productivity. It has an elegant syntax that is natural to read and easy to write. Now, I don't think there's many programming languages out there that will advertise themselves and say we're really awkward to work with and a massive pain. So this maybe doesn't mean too much. But I think that having worked with Ruby for a number of years, the idea of elegance and it being natural to read and write, I think really comes through quite strongly when you work with the language. It was first released in 1995, but its popularity has really exploded in the last 15 years or so, and that is especially thanks to Rails. Ruby is completely free to use, as well as free to copy, modify, distribute. That freedom permeates throughout the Ruby ecosystem. There's a real strong ethos for open source software and shared libraries across the board. Ruby is object-oriented through and through. Everything in Ruby is an object. I'm not going to go much into the technical details of what that means or of other facets of Ruby, but I would really encourage you to look into it. If Ruby interests you, then there's a really great sort of 30 minutes or so. Experienced programmers will tell you even less. Kind of a little course called Try Ruby. I've got some details about that at the very end, which is just a great introduction to Ruby's syntax. And yeah, just an introduction to the language. As with all tech these days, it seems, as a package manager. So Ruby has what are called gems. So Ruby gems are Ruby's packages. And the next thing I'm going to talk about is one of the most popular gems out there, and certainly one of the reasons why Ruby is such a widely used language nowadays. And that is, of course, Rails. A couple of quick things here. Sorry, so that's Try Ruby on the right and the Ruby Lang website on the left, which just gives you more details about the language. There's links to this stuff at the end anyway. So Ruby on Rails, I'm going to simply refer to as Rails, is a web development framework, and it is built with Ruby. Many of you will have heard of Basecamp. A lot of you, I'm sure, will have used it. What some of you might not know is that Rails was actually created out of Basecamp. This guy, DHH, he and his team built Basecamp. He took the decision to build it in Ruby, and then essentially extracted out the patterns that they built for this one web application, Basecamp, into then a framework to build more web applications. Nowadays, Rails has had thousands of contributors. It's all open source, but the team at Basecamp still continue to, as they develop Basecamp and some of their other Rails apps that they've got, they continue to abstract patterns out of that, and those that fit end up in Rails core. I personally think that's really great. I think that's quite exciting that this big, widely used product, they're happy to share some of their secrets. Essentially, as developers, they build in patterns, and then they think, actually this is something that's applicable more widely. Let's put it into Rails. Rails also powers a number of other internet giants: GitHub, Shopify, Airbnb, Twitch, a lot more. Some of these use Rails throughout. Some of them kind of started off as Rails and have perhaps evolved into something more. But certainly Rails is influential in a number of very large scale, popular, big web apps. Rails is an MVC framework, so that means models, views, controllers. The models are responsible for managing data. Typically, that means they are interacting with a database. Certainly in everything we use it for, typically interacting with a SQL database like Postgres or similar. Your views are responsible for your presentation. In the world of web, this means they are essentially HTML and other sprinkles. And then the controllers hook things together. They're responsible for handling your user input, your requests. They handle the interactions between the views and the models, and sort of your main business logic tends to live in and around the controllers. Convention over configuration is a term coined by DHH, and it's a paradigm that permeates throughout Rails. The idea here is that across all areas of the development of an app, there's a widely accepted normal way to achieve something. And these normals are then baked into the technology itself. You don't need to spend many hours configuring the basic settings and defaults for every new application. You can jump straight into building out the business logic of your app and know that Rails's conventions have got your app running and working in a familiar way. Here we are. So this is a good quote again from the Rails Doctrine, which says, part of the Rails mission is to swing its machete at the thick and ever-growing jungle of recurring decisions that face developers creating information systems for the web. There are thousands of such decisions that just need to be made once, and if someone else can do it for you, all the better. We'll unpack more about what this means, but not only does this mean that you can get started quicker and progress through your app without having to deliberate on kind of early stage configuration as you go, it also opens up the opportunity for large and complex features and abstractions to be added to your app with little work. If every Rails app handles a certain area of setup in the same way, then third-party libraries and big end-to-end feature setups can be so much more involved because they know what to expect. There's obviously a kind of flip side to this, a negative side to this, that if you're not in control of these conventions, what if they aren't actually spot on for your business case? What if you want to implement one of these large features you get from a Ruby gem, but you don't quite like the way it does one or two things? And that's the idea of convention over configuration. There is still configuration. A lot of things you can still customize and change things throughout the way Rails works, but you're leaning heavily on the convention. And I think that's where you need to choose the right tool for the job. As an agency at Storm, we're dealing with people who want the MVP. Success for our clients is not usually the most technically accomplished software, but it's the software which can be used to establish themselves in a market or to prove a concept. And for that, you need speed and you need a level of reliability. You need to know that within a certain budget, you're going to get something out the door. You're going to get it in front of users. It may not be perfect in every way for what you've imagined, but it's out there, it works, and it can, prove your concept or as I said, establish a market. Generally, our projects then are largely composed of technical elements that we know have a proven track record. We're pulling in tools and things that we've already used and we know they're going to work. So we're going to dive into some examples. I'm going to show some bits of code. I think in this context, showing lots of code often isn't too helpful because code needs context to kind of make sense. So we're going to predominantly be living in that context space. We're going to be talking about code without necessarily talking about the code itself. But I also show some code examples. Anyway, so we're going to break down this idea of convention over configuration into a few kind of smaller parts. One of the key facets of convention over configuration is what could be described as zero config, or it's similar to what's sometimes referred to as sensible defaults. There's many moving parts to modern web applications. A lot of decisions have to be made about how these parts talk to each other. And many of these decisions are in themselves fairly inconsequential. There's any number of answers that you could say are just as valid as each other. And often you just need to pick one. As with that quote earlier, if someone else has already made that decision for you, great, you can just go along with it. ActiveRecord is the ORM within Rails, so it's how Rails apps talk to a database. It's built into Rails. It really is kind of the heart of database-driven Rails applications. And ActiveRecord has many what I would refer to as sensible defaults baked into it. It's easy to forget that actually there's a lot of decisions that have been made when you don't see those decisions because they've already happened. So here is a bit of Ruby code. This is establishing just a class called article. In our fictional web application, we've got articles, and the article belongs to an author. That's all you need to set up a model called article to be able to store articles in your database somewhere. You need to have the relevant tables and things in the database, but we don't need to worry about that right now. There's a lot of assumptions here. There's lots of hidden stuff going on, but we don't need to declare in the code because we know Rails' defaults. So there's no declaration here about what the name of the database table is where we're storing these articles. There's no declaration of the primary key. We've got an association going on, how an article belongs to an author. There's no declaration of how they relate, what the foreign key is, because there's defaults here. If your model name is article, your model's names are singular. The database table will simply be a plural of that name. If you don't tell the app what the database table here is, then it will assume that the database table is called articles. That's it. The primary key will always simply be a column called ID. The foreign key will be the name of the association plus an underscore plus an ID. That's something that if you're new to Rails, then you have to kind of pick up and learn these things. But when you've been working with Rails for a while, they're second nature. And the fact that you don't have to declare them means you don't have to worry about them. If we take an example, this is the same class, but where we make all those things explicit. So if you did want a different name, you can put them in. Rails gives you the ways to specify those. But so let's say if we wanted to specify the table name was article, we wanted to specify the primary key was ID. On this association, we wanted to say, an article belongs to an author, and the author, the class for an author is author, and the foreign key is author ID. Now, you tell me which one of those is going to be easier to write, a bit easier to read once you've kind of got the hang of these things. And then, you've got all these defaults, but sometimes you need to stray from these defaults. So let's say our authors are actually users of the application. We've got another model somewhere called user, and actually when you create an article, we want the author to be that user record. Now we can update our association. So say belongs to author and then say class name user. Now I've done the same in the second example, but that change, that almost stray from the norm, that stray from the sort of assumed default is suddenly now much more hidden because it's surrounded by all this cruft. It's surrounded by the declaration of the table name, the primary key, the foreign key, all these bits. And so actually, if you kind of go back and forth between these two, in the first example, it's very obvious that, we're doing something slightly outside the normal here. Let's flag it up. We're making sure that we've got an association here where actually the class name of the object we're associated to isn't the same as the name of the association. But in the second example, you almost lose the fact that change is in there. Now, the fact that comes out is quite valuable when you're scanning this file. It's valuable to know that this association between an article and a user, we've given it the name author. That's important metadata. That's really valuable, that we now know how a user of the application and an article are related. Author tells us that they wrote that article. So that being really sort of obvious and coming out in that way, because it's a stray from the norm, is really valuable. And so the fact that when we stick to the norm, we don't have to specify it. It means when we stray from the norm, it's obvious, it's right in our face. So that's one example. At the heart of your Rails app would be ActiveRecord. There's lots of just assumed things that go on there. Another area where this notion of zero config shines through is in security. Rails has matured a lot over the years and added lots of new security features as it has done. By default, without any configuration, really, you get a number of solid security features in place. Your application has generated secret keys that are then used for encryption. There's even a built-in interface for encrypting and storing API keys and tokens, things like that, right into your app, so you can easily share them across environments. Cookies and sessions are all encrypted by default. Cookies have all sorts of security features on them that I don't understand at all, but you can read all about them on Rails guides. CSRF protections baked into every form, and then the security headers kind of by default on every request. There's lots of stuff that just happens. All of these security settings can be customized. If you have specific needs or specific concerns and you have a web security expert at hand, then you can do that. You can get involved, you can change that. But if you're someone like me and you're not a web security expert, but you're a developer and just want to get on and build apps, then when I'm working with Rails, I'm confident that the base of my app is secure, that I don't really need to worry about any kind of attacks on my app, because I know that it's had these years of maturity. And as long as I kind of stay within the lines of the main ways you build an app with Rails, I know that I'm covered. Obviously, I can still write rubbish code that opens up security flaws in the app, but no framework's going to stop you from that. So another facet of convention over configuration is this idea that everything has a home. Now, this isn't unique to Rails in any way, but this is one thing that certainly makes a big difference practically to us as an agency. On a standard week, we'll be committing code to anywhere from 3 up to sometimes 6 or 7 different Rails apps. While individual developers tend to stay on a project for longer periods of time, we inherently need to chop and change developers between projects. And especially we all need to be on hand to pick up older projects for support work when it comes in. The fundamental file structure of a Rails project hasn't changed for many years. So any Rails developer can jump into a project quickly and be able to find what they're looking for. We'll come back to one part of what makes this really significant shortly. But next, I'm just going to talk a little bit about consistent markup. Obviously, Rails applications are web-based, so the primary output is HTML markup. Rails comes packed full of helper methods for building out complex HTML views. But the consistency of markup between projects does tend to be something you need to kind of work deliberately at. It doesn't come completely naturally and completely baked in with Rails. At Storm, we have a relatively consistent set of tools that are involved in generating our markup. We use the Haml templating language, which plays very nicely with Rails. We use a gem called Simple Form, which is just fantastic for generating forms. And you can do lots of really complicated stuff with that, or lots of simple stuff with it. Kind of includes in the name, but it tries to really keep your main views clean. And we also use Foundation CSS, and in using Foundation CSS, that dictates some of what we need to do with our markup. And one of the big joys of keeping markup consistent between projects is how easy it is to sprinkle JavaScript improvements into your app. We rarely use big modern JavaScript frameworks for any of our projects. But over the past couple of years, we've started using Stimulus.js a lot for those UI improvements and extra levels of interactivity that only JavaScript can really bring. I won't go heavily into stimulus, but it's actually also created by the team at Basecamp. It plays very nicely with Rails. It's designed, I mean, this quote says it's designed for the HTML you already have. So it's essentially you just add a few data attributes here and there, and in theory it all plays nicely with the markup you've got. As I've said, with our markup being relatively consistent between projects, we can then share our stimulus controllers between projects and easily pass them off, and you know, add these little interactions that otherwise might take a long time to hook up with very minimal effort. One actual example we've got, I'm not going to show the JavaScript code, but on the left is what we need to write in our form view to put a password input in place. You simply say, I want an input that we're duplicating the word password there, but the second one is saying the type of input is password. The first one is saying the name of it is password. But we then have a stimulus controller. It's 22 lines of JavaScript. It's just called password peak controller, and it gives us that little button on the right, where you can, it's quite nice for users often in certain applications to be able to have a look at what the password is before submitting it. Because all of our apps generate the same markup, because we're using the same markup generating helpers, we can copy that JavaScript controller straight into any of our apps that have that markup, and it just works. And that's what's great about keeping that consistency between projects. Rails has built-in generators. This is where Rails' consistent file structure really shines. However much Rails saves on configuration in the early stage of the application, however many sensible defaults there are throughout a project, you still obviously need to write code to find your business logic. Models need database migrations to configure the tables and columns in your database. Your main logic needs controllers to hook into, yada yada. You need to set everything up, but you don't actually have to start from scratch with all of that. We've got this one liner here: Rails generate scaffold. Rails has a number of different types of generators. Scaffold is sort of the most involved one. So we can say I want to generate a scaffold for a model called article. It's got a title, it's got a slug, it's got a body. The title and the slug are strings by default. They're because we haven't specified the type they are, the strings. The body is a text input. Running this one command, we get generated for us the model and the associated database migration. We get the routes and the controller actions for every CRUD action, for creating those, listing them out, showing individual ones, editing, updating them, deleting them. We get views for all of those actions that need them. We get a whole suite of tests for all of the above, and we get more. And these generators will also depend on exactly how you set it up. This example I've pasted there is actually exactly what you get from a brand new Rails project if you were to run that command. I personally don't tend to use the scaffold generator too much. I probably should, because it is really powerful. But I do use the model generator every time. Every time I'm creating a new model, you need to generate the migration to update your database to reflect alongside it. Here's just an example of what you would run: Rails generate model, comment. We've even got calls to references in there. Rails will set that model up with the relevant associations, the relevant foreign keys. It does that for you. You don't even need to write that code that can get a bit repetitive. So that's Rails generators. That's where having that consistent markup, having that consistent file structure really shines, because Rails knows where that code's going to be, so it can put it there for you. So this other point, I'm not a Japanese speaker. This is a Japanese word. I believe it's pronounced omakase or something like that. Anyway, DHH released an article a number of years back that was titled "Rails is omakase." I won't reiterate everything from that post. If you're interested, I'd encourage you to go away and read it. You can just type Rails is omakase into Google, you'll find it. But essentially, it's a Japanese culinary term that is a meal consisting of dishes selected by the chef. And you're essentially saying to the chef, you've made this food, I'm happy to go with what you think is best. The idea is the chef has pulled together all parts of a well-rounded and complementary meal, and it's all there for you. Within reason, you can swap bits out. If there's a certain component that you really know you don't like, you can swap that out for something else. But it's a system of components that the person who's made that food knows that they work together. And this plays nicely into Rails. Rails is many different components, and they all play nicely together, because the people who created Rails, the people who created those components have designed them all with each other in mind. Many of them are available as separate packages. You can use them on their own in different contexts. They will stay within their lanes, but they will also work well together and talk to each other. An example here of what this really allows, say you want a WYSIWYG rich text editor in your application. There's a few different parts to this. You need to have the form field and the controls for styling the content within the form field. You need to then know how to display and style that content within the form field. You need to know then how to store this in a database. You need to know how to display the outputted content then in a view with the styling that you've attached. There's quite a few moving parts here, kind of through front end to back end and everything. Rails comes with something called action text. You run Rails action text install. That will automatically set you up with all the JavaScript you need. It will pull it in. It will pull in the style sheets you need. It will set up the database migration you need for storing those things. And straight away, you now have a rich text editor in your application that literally in minutes, and you've got a WYSIWYG editor with rich text. Another example, file uploads. Similar, maybe not quite as complex, but you need the form field. You need the backend storage of where those files are living. You need the associated models of how those files then relate to the rest of your data. Active storage is baked into Rails. You can immediately get up and running with various storage backends out of the box. It supports S3, Microsoft Azure, Google Cloud Storage, and you can then attach those to your existing models with ease. Here's the code we would have if we had this article class from earlier. Has rich text body is our action text. Has one attached header image, has many attached gallery images. All these things, because in this world of omakase, they are all designed to work with each other. They're all designed essentially by the same people. So if you're happy to go with what they've selected for you, they all just play together nicely. In that actual example of the WYSIWYG editor, there were files within that rich text editor. That's action text and active storage just talking to each other seamlessly. And that's where this idea of selecting these defaults, if you're happy with them, it shines. You can get these things up and running in minutes. As long as you're happy not to be completely in control, this is the key thing, is I haven't written all this code to make all this work. So it works the way they've decided it works. So you get these big end-to-end complex features set up, as I said, in minutes, but you just have to be happy to relinquish some control. And that's why I've said at Storm, that's fine for us. We're building the MVP. We're building something that works quickly to establish a market, get users on board. I'll quickly talk a little bit about in-house conventions. Consistency between Rails projects helps us in our agency world, where developers are regularly context switching between apps. While Rails' own conventions give a lot of consistency between projects, it's a framework designed for web application development of all shapes and sizes. Our projects at Storm tend to have significantly more overlap and more areas of consistency. So we've taken this idea of convention over configuration further internally. We've created our own project Kickstarter, as we call it. It's a pretty new thing still. We actually only have one active client project created from the Kickstarter. It's something we've really been focusing on over the last few months. But we've spent a good while pulling all of our favorite practices and favorite technologies from various projects we've worked on and compiling them into one Storm Sensible Defaults package. And the idea is every new client project will now start from that. Pretty much every app we build is going to have user authentication. It's going to have an admin area with some form of kind of pagination and search for our clients to know what their users are doing. It's going to have some sprinkles of JavaScript, stimulus controllers I was talking about. Our Kickstarter has all of these. It also has the testing tools we use. It has monitoring tools. It has setup for Amazon S3, various other quality of life bits and pieces. And by having this ground level to start us off, we're pretty much skipping the first 2 days or so of any new project because it's already there for us. And we know that every project now has this level of consistency. So we have it now at Storm as Rails developers. We feel comfortable because We've got Rails's base level of conventions that we're predominantly following. We've then got on top of that some more Storm specific conventions. And then obviously each individual project may have then a few conventions within it that's specific to that project. But it means you kind of feel at home when you're working on any of our apps, because we've put that time and effort into kind of managing that level of, there's different levels of convention. So in summary, we've spoken a bit about the foundations of Ruby, the foundations of Rails. We've talked about how strong conventions within the Rails ecosystem help Rails developers who are working on different applications to keep their work consistent. We've seen how it allows you to implement large and technically significant features with minimal effort, and how many mundane decisions are just taken care of for you and you don't have to worry about them. I've also shared how this in particular benefits us at Storm in efficiently building apps for our clients to break into a market, to prove a business concept, while us developers remain in familiar territory. If you're interested in learning more, there's a few bits of sort of further reading I've got here. As I said, try Ruby. It's just a great 30-minute interactive tutorial of the basics of Ruby syntax. Rails guides, there's some real beginner's guides, get up and running with Rails, as well as some really advanced stuff. And also the design principles behind Rails are documented in what's called the Rails Doctrine. That is sort of where a lot of what I've spoken about today is documented. If you'd like to find out more about Storm, you can find us stormconsultancy.co.uk or at Storm UK on Twitter. This is cliche to say at the end of the talk, but we are hiring. We are hiring for developers at different levels, for junior as well as experienced developers. Whether or not you have Rails experience, if what I've spoken about today looks like something that you'd love to feature in your day-to-day job, get in touch with me and I can point you in the right direction of our job adverts. Yeah, there we are.
Great, thanks.
That is all I have to say. Over to you, Nick.
Thanks, Mark. I'm going to ask everyone to unmute. Maybe we can show our appreciation for the talk. Thanks, Mark.
Thank you very much.
Sometimes there's a few dogs barking when we all unmute. It's, so maybe now we can move into the Q&A. I don't know if you've got any questions that people have that has triggered. Is there anyone who's interested in transitioning or trying out Ruby? Any questions for how to get going, that kind of thing? Or do you want to shall I just give you a second, see if we've got any questions? Here we go. So Matt, do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Yeah, let me just put a door shut, hang on. Cool. Yeah, so as my message says, so how do you solve convention creep? So that being where you come up with the conventions that you're going to follow, but then software gets new versions, you say, oh, that's a good technology, we'll use that to solve this particular problem. But all of a sudden you've then got 30 projects that are very similar, but also different. So you still have that kind of overhead of when you're context switching, it's close enough, but you've still got to find the nuances of a project, whether that be from different versions or slightly different technology that's also been adopted. Yeah, how do you go about solving that kind of issue, or is it not an issue for yourselves?
That's a great question. I think what I would say is that Rails's conventions are pretty strong and do permeate through everything. So while obviously every project has a completely different data model, completely different user interface structure and that sort of thing, I think actually on a code level there is a lot of consistency, and I think that's just because Rails conventions are strong and permeate through everything. I think there's definitely a concern there. I think particularly with our Kickstarter, we need to make sure that as new things come out, we need to work out, are we adding this to the Kickstarter? Are we not? If we're adding it to the Kickstarter, do we then need to look at adding it to the apps that came from the Kickstarter? I think when creating the Kickstarter, we put quite a bit of effort into making sure we gave it what it needed, but not too much. There was a level of not too much, not too little. Ultimately, we use various tools that perhaps we use in half our projects, as they'd be familiar to us, but actually they're not appropriate for all of our projects. I think that whatever you do, there's a level of, you know, the more work you've done on a specific project, the more you will know the ins and outs of that. And so I think it's just the balance. I realize I haven't really answered your question.
That's fine.
I think, you know, you need to be careful of it. I think that generally Rails' conventions are so strong that there will be just a lot of consistency between projects in code, just because those code conventions are strong. But absolutely, yeah, you need to be careful. When something new and shiny comes out, I think maybe you go and say, I really want to use this in this project, but that will make it harder for other members of the team to jump on that one, you know, and you say, okay, let's not play with this new and shiny thing yet. Let's wait, you know, give it a few months. If it's still new and shiny and still looks great, then we look at adding it to all of our projects. But I think that, yeah, there has to be a level of saying we need to keep this project consistent. So even if, you know, something, yeah, as I said, something you want to involve in the project comes along, maybe you say, no, let's not. I see Adam nodding at that. So I don't know, Adam, if you want to quickly chip in with something on that last point.
Maybe that's something we could you know, get involved with the panel. I just wondering, in follow-on question from that is, has a convention ever changed? Has there been a breaking change in terms of compatibility, especially for Rails? Did the language design get it right?
I think one big thing within the Ruby and Rails world that changes a lot is there's probably two. The templating language and testing framework are probably two of the biggest kind of points where people will differ. We nowadays use Haml for our templating, and we use Minitest for testing. There's another library called RSpec for testing. We have some projects that run on RSpec. We have some projects that run on Minitest. More recent projects have been more consistent in that we've kind of made a decision and said we're going for Minitest. I personally have more experience with RSpec. I think I prefer RSpec, but I go down the line of, you know, for keeping projects consistent, I'm creating a new project, I'm going with Minitest because that's what we've decided. So yeah, inevitably things will change. You just have to, I think as a team, you just have to make that decision collectively, talk about it a lot, and make sure you're all on board with the decision you're making, and you know, accept the bigger picture, even if this tool isn't what I would personally choose, even if maybe the other tool is a tiny bit better suited for this specific project. Look at the bigger picture and go, we as a business need as much consistency as we can between our projects, because we know what value that gives. So I think, yeah, it's just a case of considering the fact that changing a convention brings about some less than ideal side effects. You then need to just weigh that up, whether it's worth then changing it for those. Sometimes it will be, sometimes it won't be.
Okay, cool. Are there any other questions from the floor before we go to the panel? I don't see anything in there. No other burning questions from people. Okay, no problem. So we're going to now introduce a couple of new voices. I'd like to introduce Adam Butler. Do you want to say hi, Adam?
Hi there, I'm Adam. I've been a Ruby dev for about 8 years now, founder of Tech Talks and a contract developer.
Cool. And you're so you're founder of Tech Talks. Tech Talk, is that built with Ruby, Adam?
Yeah. So it's built on Ruby on Rails as is most of my stuff.
Just checking. And also I'd like to introduce Adam Pope, who is the CTO of Storm. Hi there, Adam.
Hi, Nick.
So I guess one of my questions is around maybe the popularity of the language, because I noticed, and I think I tweeted it out, some of the Red Monk surveying. It was a top right language in terms of popularity, just behind JavaScript, the triumvirate of JavaScript, Python and Java. I'm just wondering, is that kind of not surprising to you panelists? Is that kind of expected?
It's a little bit surprising to me. I think over the last couple of years, I could reasonably say that like Ruby has been going down in popularity, but it's seen an uptick a bit more recently, where I think a lot of people are getting fed up of kind of tech fatigue of, hey, we're going to containerize everything and deploy it with Kubernetes, or this new JavaScript framework came out and then nobody uses it 6 months later and things like that. So I think like over the last sort of 8 years or so, I've seen it sort of trickle down, not very fast, just a little bit, but then a big resurgence a bit more over the last couple of years, where people just want to solve problems and not, you know, play with new tech.
Yeah. Okay. So it's just it's a language of getting stuff done. Is that the bottom line? And Adam Pope, is that kind of would you expect that popularity?
I think it's the kind of language that the people that know it love it and will always use it, and therefore that will continue to be popular. I think where it fluctuates in maybe perceived popularity is what new people get introduced to when they start web development. And you know, over the last few years, most of the boot camps started teaching React as the sort of default stack that people should know. So maybe within the more junior community, Ruby is less well known. But I think, as I say, the people that know it and love it have been using it and carry on using it because it, as you say, it gets the job done, and it's a fantastic tool for it.
Well, there's like, it seems to be like one target audience, you know, the market and what the market needs in terms of skills. But then the other side of that is, I guess, what we'd call, you know, the developer happiness side of it. So would you say that Rails comes down on the developer happiness side of things? Yeah,
absolutely. It's just a pleasure to work with it most of the time. DHH is an incredibly opinionated chap. Rails is an incredibly opinionated framework that sometimes puts people's backs out, and they don't particularly like his opinions and they don't like the defaults. But say it for the people that like it, I think it gets the job done. And
are the defaults up for debate? As in, if someone doesn't like it, is there a forum in which they can have that conversation with the people who designed the language?
Yeah, it's all done through GitHub issues, and there are many, many debates on there about things that should be changed. Not very many people are successful in changing those defaults, I think it's probably fair to say, but people can try.
Yes.
If you ever want to see a GitHub issue thread with lots of those, you know, emoji reactions on every comment, and a lot of Ruby and Rails threads. Some of the members of the Rails core team are more stubborn than others, should we say, in responding to change. But certainly, some big conventions within the framework have changed over the years, and you know, it's been heavily discussed and weighed as to why they've changed.
Well, that's an interesting thing, isn't it? Because a lot of open source projects, you know, get pulled in a lot of different directions and need a lot of governance and structure to sort of keep it on track. Do you think that the language has quite a clear goal for the language, for what it's trying to achieve, and is that what is kind of, you know, driving the philosophy?
I think so. I think, you know, one of the things beyond sort of the developer happiness that I think they try and promote is allowing one engineer to feel like a team of people. And that like feeds into why you kind of have these sharp tools out of the box and these sensible defaults, because it's kind of like giving you this like big tool set to use. And it's been around a long time. You mentioned earlier about the conventions and whether you know, whether conventions get broken. It hasn't for a while. More or less all of the releases of Rails itself, since I think 3.2, we're now on 6, so 3.2 was about 8 years ago, I think.
Okay.
Have been new features and functionality and really, really minor changes. But in terms of kind of breaking stuff, it feels as though the foundations are solid. So sort of anything that they sprinkle on top is sort of new toys to play with, and
Because I looked up and I found the Great Rails migration of 2.x to 3. I don't know if you were around.
Yeah, I think it was
migration.
3.2, which was the real headache, because like 3.1 and 3.0 and 3.1 like followed all of the 2.0 stuff. So yeah, it's that whole world of pain, which I do.
Those early days. I mean, it feels like that was much earlier days, and now perhaps it's settled down into its rhythm of releases.
Yeah, I think the 2.x to 3 was when they merged MERB with Rails. So it was the kind of collision of two frameworks, and they took the best bits of each one, and yeah, lots of stuff changed in that process. But yeah, as I said, I started using Rails around 3.1, 3.2, something like that, and really, apart from how request parameters are handled by controllers, not a lot has really changed.
Yeah,
so it's mostly adding stuff.
So that speaks to your point, Mark, around the stability. Well, you actually said speed and reliability. So does that, the being backwardly compatible comes perhaps under the reliability aspect of the language, maybe? I don't know if
I think so, because I think, as I've said, the framework is lots of different components, and as Adam said, over the more recent major versions, they've added new components in, but certainly those core components, the base of ActiveRecord and action controller and these key components that are the foundations of the app have remained mostly consistent. So all of my years of experience of working on Rails apps, I know how those things work. I know I can rely on them to do certain jobs because they've remained the same, and they've got new features and improvements, but foundationally they're consistent.
Okay, so could you perhaps express the goal of the language in like just a few words? Is it the developer happiness thing, or is it just literally the speed of getting things done?
I think those two things don't need to be separate, because I think certainly for me, as I've built software and got further on in my career of building software, I've become slightly less infatuated by tech and exciting shiny tech toys, but more about using tech to solve people's problems. Mm-hmm. And I think what makes me happy as a developer is, sure, elegant technical solutions, but it's elegant technical solutions to people's real problems. And I think that's where Rails shines. Is Rails goes, your users have this real problem. Here's a nice, clean, elegant way to solve that. And you go, great, I've written nice, clean, easy code, but it really fixes this problem for these users. So I think that developer happiness and writing clean code, sure, but developer happiness and solving users' problems pretty quickly and efficiently.
Yeah, I think it says a lot that one of the most popular Ruby on Rails blogs is called Boring Rails, which is just, like the tool is less important than the problem that you're solving. Like the tool's there to kind of get the job done. And if it can do it in such an elegant way that just gives you the flow so you can focus on the business problem, it's doing its job.
Yeah, I like that. It's like the politics, politics should be boring, and maybe, the tech stuff should just be boring because it's just getting on doing what it does.
We can live and dream.
I think further than that, Ruby itself hasn't changed much in recent years as well. They've kind of been very stable, added a few bits and pieces, working on speeding it up a lot. But with other languages, they've gone through these major version changes, which has caused enormous upheaval and division in the communities. Ruby hasn't really got that. I think the worst it gets is an argument about which hash syntax you particularly like. So yeah, and I think the developer happiness bit comes from Matt, the creator of Ruby. And I was thinking about this earlier on, that when I'm writing code now, I very, very rarely have to think how to write Ruby. It's such a simple, intuitive, natural language that you can really focus on solving the problem you're trying to solve, and not how do I wrangle this into the code. There's no superfluous syntax to worry about. And the core language and the standard library are so elegant and consistent that you haven't got that mental overhead of how do I implement the thing that I'm trying to solve.
That's good. Good. There's another question actually in the chat. That's Matt. Do you want to ask your other question that you typed there at 8:55? Do you want to unmute and ask that?
Yeah, sure. Why not? So yeah, I was just wondering, what's your thoughts? Is Ruby kind of too tightly bound to Rails? So, whenever people talk about Ruby, they're always talking about Rails. Does Ruby have much of a use case outside of Rails, basically? Would you pick it up if you were just doing some general scripting on a server, like you would say with like Python, for example?
I think absolutely. I know from my experience hiring engineers that I quite often try and dig into, like somebody who's got a lot of Rails experience, whether they actually really know Ruby, like, because there's a lot of like DSL in Rails that sort of allow you to get stuff done. So, and this comes with everything from the testing to your routing to your ActiveRecord stuff, that it kind of disguises a little bit of like how because it gives you so many tools off the shelf. Like if somebody was trying to build something without all of those tools off the shelf, do they know how to still do that with all of the elegance that like Rails makes it so easy to do? But one second point, which probably isn't what you're kind of coming at, that I did want to make is Rails isn't just Ruby. Rails, the framework uses Ruby, but it's got kind of JavaScript components to it. So it's UJS library is the thing that allows you to make sort of Ajax calls with like a nice, syntax sugar, just add it and it just works. And then you got the Stimulus.js framework and Hotwire, which are kind of allow you to achieve some of the things similar to what React and Vue and things like that give you, but in a way where you're not duplicating code. So Rails, although like the bulk of it is sort of this Ruby framework, it's not just Ruby, I'd say, as well.
Yeah, fair point.
Am I being a bit pejorative then to say that the sweet spot for Ruby on Rails is web and CRUD? Is it for database backed websites? Is that its sweet spot, do you think?
I definitely think so. Like if you look at Ruby as a language and compare it to Python, its functionality, like what it kind of gives you out of the box, is really, really similar. The differentiating thing, other than the syntax between the two, are the communities and what the communities are doing with those language.
Yeah.
With the language, I think that's what differentiates it more than like this language can do this and this one can't. Like they're similar in that regard. Yeah,
because what I'm thinking is that Python has lift under its wings from the data science community, and has great support within data science and indeed academia. So I'm wondering whether Ruby enjoys really good support, within sort of B2B and B2C. Presumably that's the bread and butter for Storm, Adam.
Absolutely. In terms of Rails, that is the sweet spot. In terms of Ruby as a language, it's a difficult one. It's almost a victim of its own sort of. It's so general, and that it doesn't necessarily have that kind of obvious sweet spot. In that maybe it's not quite as good at string manipulation as Perl might be, or not as fast as Perl might be. But you wouldn't want to write a big app in Perl, and its maths isn't quite as fast as Python's maths libraries are. So you can't really do data science in Ruby. So its ability to create DSLs and its kind of meta-programming system really lends itself to things like Rails, but things like parsing and manipulating documents, configuration tools like Chef are written in Ruby. So yeah, it's really good for that kind of sysadmin-y stuff. And certainly the original question was, would you use it for just some general scripting? Absolutely. I've got dozens of scripts written in it. I mean, partly because Ruby is the thing I know, so it's the thing I pick up and go to. But as a tool for getting something done quickly, in a way that's pleasant, it's a hell of a lot better than writing a bash script.
Okay, well, it is the top of the hour, but I'm gonna ask one final question, and then maybe we can people who want to drop off can drop off, and we'll turn to more social setting. But I'm just wondering, picking up on your point, Adam Butler, about the importance of the actual community, like the Ruby community, and maybe could you kind of like speak to that a bit about the the actual community and the people who you've interacted with in that community?
Yeah. To be perfectly honest, I'd actually say the Ruby community isn't all that vocal. Like there is less to share than, for instance, I run the Bristol JavaScript community. JavaScript is ever changing. There is a new framework every single week that we can demo. So we kind of have less of that sort of interaction of like, here's a hot new tool. But we are actually really lucky to have the Southwest Ruby community here, just kind of on our doorstep, which I'd actually say is sort of one of the leading Ruby communities around the world, because they Cookpad have like pulled in Mats twice for talks. So Mats is a creator of Ruby, and Aaron Patterson, they've had him over and things like that. So they've done a lot of work supporting the community. So it's nice to have something so strong on the doorstep. They got a really good Slack community, but sort of generally worldwide, I think, it doesn't quite compare to sort of other languages, I guess. It's not as noisy, I'd say, but that might be a good thing.
There's a phrase that permeates throughout Ruby, which some of the people here will know, which is min swan, which is so Mats, as Adam said, is the creator of Ruby. The phrase means Mats is nice, so we are nice. And that phrase is often used as a hashtag and a thing. And it's just this idea that Mats, for people that have seen him and approached him, just seems like a genuine, approachable, happy guy. And that permeates a bit through the design of the programming language he's created, but also permeates through the community. And people say, Mats, this guy who's created this language that we love, he's a nice guy. Let's us also be nice. And that's just, that genuinely, it's a silly little thing, but actually I think that does shine through with interactions at Ruby conferences and events and things.
Yeah, sounds like a great community. And so for people who want to maybe get involved in that community, what's the best way for people to to do that?
Adam Butler, you're probably best to answer this.
First of all, join our Slack. So we're Southwest Ruby. Just Google us. I think we'll come up straight away. And we've got an event, I think on the 17th of March. I've not been involved in organizing it, really. But yeah, coming up soon. And it's always nice to hear from sort of newbies within the community as well. It's always nice to like hear somebody's experience learning like Ruby and Rails and kind of seeing how we can kind of nurture that growth, because ultimately more people using it means better support going forward. So yeah, we want to see more people. Okay,
that's great. So I guess I'm going to pull the panel to a close there. But I think I'm just going to keep the channel open. I'll do the final few slides, and then maybe if people want to hang around and chat, then we can hang around and chat. Or if people don't want to, then let's not. Let's see how that works. But I'll just finish off by. Can you see these slides? So all of the Bristech videos are recorded. I'll be putting up the last few. I'm a bit behind at the minute, but they will go up on the YouTube channel, briz.tech/videos. The next event is on April Fools, so let's see what that brings. And our sponsors, so GoCo Group, Oracle Cloud, Storm, and Ovo. So without them, we couldn't make this happen. So thanks to our sponsors. And that's the end of this session. But I mean, if people want to hang out and chat, that's cool. I'm gonna stay on. I was gonna put us into breakout rooms, but I can't. But I'm not going to. Let's just have a conversation.
Nick.
Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Nick.
I'm pretty tempted to learn Ruby, I think.
Give Try Ruby a go. It's just a really quick introduction to just the basic syntax. And
I've got written on my notes here, the grass actually sometimes is greener on this side.
Boom.
Yeah, I had a question. Muted. Okay. So Rails is producing MVC apps. Do you get any pushback from your clients initially? Are they all expecting like SPA type activity?
From Storm's point of view, we are very clear from the outset that that's not the kind of apps we build, and that does lose us some business from people that specifically know that that's what they want. But
it lets you get things to market quicker.
Yeah, very few clients come with that kind of preconceived technology notion, or certainly not to us anyway. We're very much dealing most of the time with non-technical founders who want something that is going to be high quality and works, rather than somebody who is specifically looking for a Rails house to come and to build something or work on something. What I would say is that we have always shied away from React and Vue and Angular and those kinds of things, because we've always felt that for the types of app we build, predominantly CRUD apps, it's unnecessary in the vast majority of cases. It has its place, but it's been, in my opinion, very much overused. And Rails as a framework is doing its best to sort of patch in some of the shortcomings of the HTML over the wire approach with tools like Hotwire and the UJS libraries that Adam mentioned earlier, so that you can have a form submission be handled asynchronously with no code involved. And it's got a WebSocket framework out of the box in Action Cable, which allows you to sort of wire up those interactive pieces as and when you need it. But it is based on that as and when it's needed, not everything must be like this because you've chosen to use React, so that's everything will be like that. So yeah, I think that's.
Are there certain sectors that maybe it's kind of like more predominant within, or is it just maybe across the board in terms of, because it's so applicable, you know, where have you got a database app, backed app, it's not kind of industry, there's no sort of industry verticals, it's just, yeah.
If you look at the slide marked up earlier, like GitHub is built on it, Basecamp is built on it, Airbnb is built on it, lots of Spotify is built on it, Shopify is built on it, Stripe is largely built on it. It's very, very broad in its usage.
It's quite an impressive list, really.
I had a question for Mark and Adam. So one of my closest friends in CTO of a competing agency, and we were talking about, him and I are both Ruby on Rails lovers, but in a similar fashion to what Storm do, building products, you're kind of getting people off the ground. And something we both had identified as an issue individually is the availability of skilled Ruby on Rails engineers, people who can then take the reins afterwards. And, you know, something that they've switched to recently, which I think is, you know, very reasonable, is building more of their products in Laravel. They much prefer the technology that Ruby on Rails affords, but it's in the better interest of their customers to give them something that they'll easily be able to hire a team of 4 or 5 engineers for immediately after they kind of let them go into the real world. Have you experienced any similar concerns to that, and how have you addressed that, if so?
So have we, well, so we haven't consciously thought about that as a reason for why we use Rails as an agency. However, we have got a few of our customers who have migrated beyond using Storm for the day-to-day and are building in-house teams. And absolutely the availability of Rails engineers in the local area is tough going at the best of times, and at the moment is really, really hard. Everybody has managed to find somebody eventually. I think there's the approach we've taken as an agency, and the approach to a degree we're taking with some of our clients that are looking as well, is that Rails and Ruby are pretty forgiving things to learn if you are a very competent programmer. So there is no real barrier to a Django or a Laravel developer or Node, Node Express, whatever. They can transition pretty quickly with some seniors around them to ask questions. So yes, I completely get that it is a problem, but we haven't so far made a conscious decision to change what we do based on sort of that ongoing process.
Are there sort of clusters, like global clusters, where there are kind of like, you know, more engineers or more availability? Those presumably it's clustered around some of the companies that do use Ruby extensively.
I think one of the particular issues within our area are there are two particular companies that can afford salaries far higher than the vast majority of startups can. So they are attracting a lot of Ruby developers to them and not leaving much for everyone else.
So they're hoovering up.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think one of the problems we've often found is there are a lot of people getting into the industry through boot camps and sort of short training courses who need an environment where they can be mentored and develop. And to an extent, say within Storm, we leave people to their own devices quite a lot, and they need to be self-sufficient. So we've always felt there was maybe just a little bit too much of a gap between those two positions, but also in the area, there aren't that many big tech companies, possibly with the recent additions of Cookpad that may change, but there aren't that many people where they have the resources to take people through those first few years. So yeah, that's one of the things we've often thought is missing in the area to kind of create the conveyor belt of people.
Well, that's a really interesting point, I think. Is where do people pick up these skills if they're entering the industry? Because I completely get that people can transition from language to language. I think that maybe doesn't happen as much as it should, but it's certainly possible. Like, you know, Python to Ruby or Java to Ruby or whatever, .NET. All those transitions are possible, but you would have thought that there probably needs to be a reason that someone would transition away from their major language.
Yes, I guess that is true.
I guess what would tempt somebody away from Python, for example? I mean, other than curiosity, because curiosity might be a large factor.
So, well, I can't speak to Python, but I know a couple of our team have moved from PHP roles into Storm, and that was partly through the interest in working with Rails, but also seeing the benefits of Rails over what they were doing with Laravel Zen framework, and how it provided a more efficient environment in which to get stuff done with a bit less boilerplate, a bit less bureaucracy in the community, and just offered an easier, more kind of developer happiness place to be.
But engineers are like pretty pragmatic types, aren't they? Do you think there's like a specific character trait that attracts people to Ruby? I saw online that someone had said that Ruby's for misfits, and it's kind of like, okay, well, is that the character trait?
Yeah, I had a note on that. I didn't agree with that sentence
Okay.
at all. And I know I'm gonna, repeating stuff said before, but it's for people who want to solve problems and not, like I love new tech, and I play with a lot of experimental and new tech and side projects. But the vast majority of what I do is I want to build businesses, I want to build products, and I want to help people, sort of achieve their business goals, and it allows me to do that really, really efficiently. And what Adam was saying about people moving from PHP to Ruby, and sort of seeing all of the tools that this kind of affords. I honestly think Ruby on Rails has had a huge impact on the PHP and Python communities, and in terms of improving those products, and the gap is really starting to narrow now.
Mm. Well, languages borrow from each other a lot, don't they? Yeah. I remember when I saw that a lot of the stuff that would happen in Java in the early days was ported over to .NET, and it's kind of like, okay, yeah, that looks familiar, but it's in a completely different language. But there it was, it was influencing.
Now, I've been doing a little bit of Swift recently, and it's the first time since picking up Ruby that I've kind of felt the same way about a language. Swift and Ruby kind of give me that feeling of wow, this is really elegant and really well thought through, and sort of allows me to solve complex problems in a really concise, elegant way. So that's something I'm sort of really excited about getting more into. I just really wish Swift had more applications outside of iOS development. I would really love to see a back-end framework built in Swift, because it's just gorgeous to use. It's so well thought through.
So if not Ruby, then Swift. If Ruby didn't exist, you'd be, okay.
But for achieving the same things as I'm doing with Ruby, it pains me to say this, but for me, it would probably be JavaScript. I think we're only just starting to see. By the way, I run the Bristol JavaScript meetup, but
don't worry.
I have plenty of negative things to say about JavaScript. But it does feel like of recent there are a couple of really nice stable tools. Next.js and Blitz.js. Blitz is actually based on Ruby on Rails, which feel like maybe the start of regaining some sanity that's kind of come from years of tech fatigue. Hopefully, but we'll see. Who knows? A few months down the line, there might be something new. But we're now seeing React has been around for a few years, and we weren't seeing that a couple of years ago with client-side libraries for having in browser. I was just trying to think what we were using years ago for our applications. I can't remember the framework now, but sort of bunny hopping between them just constantly, and it's painful. But hopefully,
Angular. Ember.
Oh wait, before Angular.
Yeah, before then.
Knockout.
Before
that.
Come on, Dave Calkins. I'm sure out of anyone, you know what I'm on about. Oh, it's gonna.
Well, I mean, are you on about jQuery and CoffeeScript and?
No.
Somewhere in between, somewhere after jQuery.
Angular framework that I've clearly had too much therapy that I've forgotten.
Don't open that box.
Oh, and what about the switch from Angular 1 to Angular 2, Adam? Adam Butler.
Are you recalling my first Bristech talk there?
No, I didn't hear that, but I must have heard another version of it somewhere.
Backbone is what I was thinking of. Yes, Backbone.js.
Backbone.
Yes,
I wrote one app in that once.
Sorry?
I was going to say, I wrote one app in that once, and it was just the bane of my life that for years afterwards I couldn't get rid of this dependency in this app, and the backbone changed and you couldn't upgrade it, and it was one of those formative experiences of why we don't use too many JavaScript frameworks and we don't jump on the new tool at Storm. That was one of my first experiences of, oh, that looks cool, let's try that. And it caused so much pain over the following few years that
Andrew, you asked about clients asking for single page web applications, and unless you're approached by a CTO or some investor that's got a tech opinion about something, people rarely want a technology. They want an experience. They want it to behave like a modern application, and they've heard that single applications are the thing to achieve that. And, you know, there are ways of doing that without having single page applications that communicate through APIs and things like that. Like when you bootstrap a Rails application, you get something called turbo links out of the box. And for instance, if you're building a really simple application, which is lots of to-do items, and at the bottom is a form, and you fill in that form and you hit the submit button, out of the box, the experience that Rails gives you to the user's perspective is identical to a single page application. It will render that in the background with some JavaScript that you didn't have to write, you don't have to touch. And once it's rendered, it will put that on screen. And the stuff that's come since then that Mark was talking about in terms of the Hotwire and Stimulus, and particularly Stimulus Reflex, sort of layers on top of that to make it even tighter, because what the example that I was on about, it would render the whole page. Maybe you don't want to render the whole page, you just want to render the new item. So you got kind of the tools to be able to emulate that stuff. And one of the things I've liked about Rails over the last few years is their ability to step back and just like watch what the tech scene is doing, watch what their kind of requirements are, and then say, you know, we've seen these, we've seen the problems they've created. So we want to give you a tool that's going to give you all of the abilities that the single page application, React and Vue and things like that are giving you, but without all of the headaches that they give you as well. You're not going to have to build a separate API. You're not going to have to duplicate your validation on the back end and the front end. And you know, there's a little bit of a lag waiting for them to come out with tools like that, because you know they like I said, they've been watching the industry and then sort of coming up with elegant solutions after the fact. But that lag, I'm sort of happy to pay for having products that will hopefully outlast my career.
That's a really good point around the longevity. I mean, that's been coming through strongly from both Adams, from you know that longevity of the technology rather than just the shiny flash in the pan that's actually going to be superseded in a year's time. That seems to me that that's coming across loud and clear as something that has value to people.
I think it's something that people, well, it's very easy to miss until you are in a position where you can be bitten by not doing it, basically. So running an agency is a classic example where you've got lots of projects on the go. If you chop and change too much, it just creates an absolute nightmare. If we have a developer who decides to go off and try something, builds a project in it, and 2 years later they leave the company, there's literally nobody who's got any idea how that thing works. Like that's useless. In a product company, maybe you can get away with it a little bit more because everybody's maybe chipping in and you build in some resilience. But yeah, we intentionally choose our tools and our stack to sort of withstand the test of time. And Rails is great because major version upgrades are relatively painless. Nothing. We have very little legacy code that we're afraid to touch because we can keep projects up to date. Even if a client isn't necessarily paying us to do the upgrade, it's like maybe a morning's work for somebody to do it, and we just do it because it makes life easier.
how does Ruby play in sort of a cloud native or in the cloud? I know we touched on that with the file storage and integration with S3 buckets and stuff like that. But I'm just wondering, in terms of deployment, like deploying in the cloud, how are you typically running the apps? Are they Docker images or what?
So Heroku really revolutionized this for Ruby. God knows how many years ago, decade ago maybe. So everybody was very happy with the PHP way of doing things, of Apache just happily running the files that you FTP'd onto your server in some sort of hacky way. But Ruby doesn't quite work in the same way, and you have to do a little bit more configuration to get it to run. So setting up a VPS with Rails on it is more painful. But then Heroku came along and was one of the first sort of platform as a service providers, where you can literally just git push your repository to them and they handle everything else. The app is just magically running on some servers, routing happens, databases happen. So that's where most of our stuff still ends up, because it's pretty flexible and it's cost effective at the low end. It gets pretty expensive if you've got a big app with lots of traffic, and then you maybe want to look at sort of doing it yourself on AWS or wherever. But yeah, certainly for getting up and running with a first version of a product, Heroku is amazing.
Yeah, I think we're out of the woods of the days of trying to like run projects on shared hosting. So fortunately that stuff's behind us. But yeah, I personally run all of my Rails projects, except for the ones I'm working with contracting on AWS myself, and I just have a Terraform set up the infrastructure for that, and I've not had to really make any major changes to that configuration in a few years. The entire thing's automated. I could set up a brand new AWS account for tech talks and create an IAM user, hit one command, and then everything goes over, and all I'd have to do is change the name servers. So that's been working for me very well for years. So yeah, that's kind of my preferred setup. And I've recently found it's quite robust, because a job that I left like months ago that's had no employees, the server's still running. So
Definitely patched then still, right?
No, definitely. It really has had 0 employees.
Well, I think that's me done for the evening. So thank you, everyone.
Yeah, thands, Andrew. Nice one.
Really interesting.
Hello.
Cheers.
Thanks, Andrew.
I
think should we call it a night? That was a lot of fun. Thanks, Mark. And yeah, it's a really great talk.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. And thanks, Adam Butler and Adam Pope. That was, yeah, really enjoyed the discussion. So
thanks for having us. Good fun.
yeah, really good fun. Do it again.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
All right. See you all.
Bye.
Good night.
Yeah.